Hello, hello. Welcome back to Loki's Library. I am the eponymous librarian, Katrina. If you are new here, welcome. Come on in, have a look around. This is where I am reading through my enormous library of books that you see partially on the wall behind me. The other half is on this wall, out of camera. But then I give you a synopsis and I tell you what I think of them. So if you like books, just aren't sure what to read next, hit that subscribe button, like and share my videos. Let me know what you think in the comments. This month, I have been reading my way through this monstrosity of a book, all 1,147 pages of text with 100 additional pages of indices and notes. Started out with books 1 and 2. Last week I got through book 3, and this week I finished books 4, 5, and 6. It was really only 570 pages, approximately 571 pages. Book 4 was the longest, 5 and 6 were fairly short, but they're very long pages. And there's a lot of not strictly needed details to wade through to get to the story, so let's get through this. We left off last week. September 1st, 1939, German tanks rolled across the border of Poland, and Poland fell fast. I mean, boom. They had horse cavalry against tanks. Like, literally, they were charging horses against tanks. Guess who won? The Polish Air Force was destroyed by September 3rd. The cities just kind of fell one by one, and on September 17th, the Soviet Union came up from the east and completed kind of the demolition of Poland. Those Russia and Germany, or Soviet Union and Germany, split that country in half, which is what they had agreed to during the non-aggression pact they had signed the month before. When Soviet Union rolled in to maintain some semblance of neutrality, they told the rest of the world that it was to protect the Ukraine from German aggression. They didn't realize how right they were when they made that statement, but that's what they said. And boom, Poland was gone. The Jewish problem that Hitler had been looking for his final solution for, those are all horrifying words that became very well known thanks to the Nuremberg trials. That was given its solution in February of 1940 when German soldiers found a small Polish town by the name of Auschwitz. And it was decided that this would be a good place to build a slave labor / extermination camp, producing needed wartime goods and implementing that final solution. By June of 1940, Auschwitz had accepted its first inmates, and it just kind of kept rolling the industrial murder line from there. In the West, nothing. Britain complained. France was like, you really shouldn't have, but we really don't want another world war. We're just going to let this go. And they sort of started mobilizing. They got their armies ready. They were sworn to come in and help Poland, and so they had that plan of attack, but they were literally on the other side of Germany from Poland, so they were really slow in getting mobilized. And Hitler was sure that he could take the rest of Europe just as easily, so he kind of began, at this point, making noises about wanting peace with England. And if war with England commenced, he said it was because England was the aggressor. Germany, at this point, just wanted peace. They just wanted peace with the rest of the world. Yeah. The rest of the world was no longer buying that level of bullshit and decided, no, we're done. Now, ultimately, to get to the Anglo-Franco alliance, Hitler had to roll through several neutral nations to get there, and he did. He went through Denmark, Norway, Belgium, and the Netherlands, just boom, 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 one after the other. Belgium and Denmark, he was able to get the kings of those nations to capitulate. Denmark, he kind of really didn't have any choice. The king of Denmark, they were literally blindsided by everything, and they had nowhere to run to. They had shared borders with Germany, and they're on the, I believe it's the Baltic Sea. Germany was able to just come in and take them, and I think they caught the king at like breakfast, and he's like, okay, well, I don't want any of my citizens dead, so just leave us alone, and fine, we'll be your protectorate. And then, that's not to say they didn't resist underground. I'm sure they did. I haven't read the books on that yet, but I'm quite sure they're there. There was a lot of resistance to the Nazis in Europe. But the Danish king was trying to protect his people. Norway, Hitler tried to roll in, and a couple of the military bases on the fjords fell quickly because the people running them were Nazi sympathizers or Nazis themselves. But some of them didn't, and they did a lot of damage to the German Navy in the process. Just sinking a lot, like half the German Navy was sunk taking Norway, which is pretty impressive. And that was a combination of Norway and the British, who were also patrolling that channel, that kind of neutral channel, trying to keep Norway neutral, such as it was. So the British ships come in, the Norse are bombing from their shores, and half the British Navy is sunk. While that's going on, the king in Oslo, the king, royal family, and the cabinet have a chance to get out of Oslo, and they flee very far north in Norway. What actually happened in Norway, and this is interesting, is one of the Nazi sympathizers, Vidkun Quisling, stepped in and like immediately took control of one of the radio towers. Was like, hey, the Nazis are here, I'm going to be in control on their behalf. Well, the people hated Quisling, all right? They knew he was a Nazi. They didn't want Nazi ideology in Norway. And so as soon as he stepped up and said that, like, rebellion was there. They were like, no, this isn't happening. So from the word go, Norway was out. They wanted no part of this, and the underground resistance began basically immediately. Belgium, you may recall, I don't know if I said it in last week's, it's certainly one of my blog posts, but Belgium was one of the signers of the Locarno Pact, which was signed in 1925 with multiple powers in Europe trying to maintain the peace. In 1937, when Hitler withdrew from the Versailles Treaty, Belgium said, okay, well, we're not going to maintain peace, we're going to withdraw from the Locarno Pact and just be neutral. So when the Nazi troops rolled into Belgium, the king there, that was Leopold, he said, okay, yes, you can do that. And that was very much against the will of the Congress in Belgium, and he was essentially ousted. Not right then, but he had to flee eventually to Switzerland, and he wasn't allowed back in the country until 1950. I mean, they did not forgive or forget easy on that one. And when he did come back, he was basically forced to abdicate in favor of his son, because the people were so furious with him for rolling over the Nazis. Let's see here. The Queen Wilhelmina in the Netherlands was able to get out. She also sought refuge in England. The Norse royal family eventually had to flee Norway entirely. They sought refuge in England, and that kind of became the base of operations for the Allies. Now, at this point, we've got all these kind of intermediary countries have fallen. The Anglo-Franco allies know the Germans are coming. They're just not quite sure where they're going to break through, and they guessed wrong. So when the German tanks rolled through, and they were able to basically trap 300,000 troops thereabouts at Dunkirk. Now, this one is one of those really famous battles that books have been written about. There was a movie a few years ago. I tried watching it, and it was distracting me too much from work, so I had to stop watching it. I'm gonna have to like dedicate time to sit down and watch it. But basically, there were all these troops at the beachhead at Dunkirk, and if Hitler had kept rolling his troops in, he could have wiped out the Allied forces, and he stopped. And I don't think they've ever had a satisfactory answer as to why he stopped. The reason given in the book is that the tanks were supposed to stop so that the Luftwaffe could come in and bomb from overseas and wipe them out aerially. This didn't happen. That hesitation gave the Allied forces time to evacuate 300,000 men to England, who were then able to come back and fight later in the war. But it wasn't easy breezy. I mean, the Luftwaffe was bombing, but they weren't as effective as I think that Hitler had hoped they would be. Now, after Dunkirk, France collapsed, and Hitler turned his eyes to England. And now that became a problem, because all those boats that he lost trying to take Norway, he had no way to get his troops to England. And of course, the English at this time are patrolling the Channel with the Royal Air Force and with their own submarines and ships and destroyers. And so there was no way to get those troops across the Channel, which means there was basically a bit of a stalemate happening in the West. At this time, Hitler started bombing London with the Luftwaffe, so this is where we get those, and like every night, he's throwing his planes in, bombing the crap out of London and all of England. And then something started happening, and this is the sort of thing where it's bad how cut off from the outside world Nazi Germany had become, because technology kept advancing in the West, and he didn't know about it. He didn't trust it, he didn't understand it, that technology being radar. The English were using it to very good effect. They used it against the U-boats, and they used it against the Luftwaffe. So every time he's sending over these bombing raids, his planes are getting shot down, just boom, 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 because they know where the planes are coming in from. They're using radar. The Germans were not nearly as effective when the British started returning the favor and sending people over to Berlin and bombing the crap out of Berlin, which Hitler seemed to think was unfair. He did not like that the war was being brought to him in Germany. He thought that was mean. Which, I don't know, apparently he doesn't understand how war works, or, didn't understand how war worked. But the RAF bombed the crap out of all of Germany, not without losses, certainly. They had their fair of fighters that were shot down, but they were immeasurably more effective because German didn't know when they were coming. Now, while England is kind of at this weird stalemate where they can only fight in the air but nothing else, Hitler kind of starts looking east. Now, from Mein Kampf, he had always said that more living room for the German people meant moving east. So his plan was always to go into Russia. He just needed Russia neutralized while he was working on the west. So now that he thinks that the Allies are at a standstill in the west and nothing more can happen there, he kind of starts looking east and going, well, I mean, Stalin, I know we had this pact, but I kind of wanted the Balkans, and you're rolling into the Balkans. I wanted them. Those are for me. That's for Germany. So that's over. We're going to attack you instead. And his plans were well known, at least to the West. Some of the personnel who worked in Berlin, German personnel, were anti-Nazis, and so they kind of took these plans and got them to the American embassy personnel, who immediately got them to J. Edgar Hoover. At the time, we didn't have the CIA. We had the OSS, which was the CIA precursor, Office of Special Services, I think. But Hoover was the guy to go to. So we got those plans to Hoover. Hoover looked at them and went, these are real. This is authentic. This is happening. And he reached out to his counterpart in the Soviet Union and said, hey, the Germans are going to attack you. And the Soviets didn't think so. They thought they had a good bead on Hitler's mind and how he worked. And when the plans, which were originally set to happen in May, didn't happen, they thought, yeah, those allies, those sneaky Americans, they're aligned to us to try and drive this wedge between us. We're just going to hold fast. Not realizing that the reason that the attack did not occur in May as originally planned was Yugoslavia. God bless Yugoslavia. Those are words I bet no one thought they would ever say regarding this tiny little nation. But in World War II, Hitler wanted Yugoslavia. The king and prime minister of Yugoslavia signed an agreement with Hitler. They were like, okay, yeah, we'll also be your protectorate. Come on in. But the people of Yugoslavia was like, no, we know what these guys are about. They're monsters. They're killing people. No. And so as soon as the king returned to Yugoslavia, that entire nation rebelled. And they were like, nope, you're out. We don't want you. They elevated his son to the throne, kicked his butt out. And as soon as the protectorate that Hitler had ordered in rolled into town, they attacked him. They were spitting on his car. They so enraged Hitler that he put off his attack on Russia by 1 month, which proved deadly. It cost Yugoslavia everything. I mean, he literally bombed this emerging country back into the dark ages. He leveled the capital city, and like 17,000 were dead just in that one city, just from the bombings. But that delay cost him everything. Because while he did invade in June, he didn't take into account that Russian winters come early and they're very hard. And militarily, I don't think there has ever been a single invading army that ever survived a Russian winter. And at first, because they rolled in June, they made incredible advances across that Soviet Union, right? I mean, 400 miles, they were just rolling in, towns were falling, the Soviet army's falling back. And then in September, the autumn rain started. Everything got bogged down in muds. They didn't have the paved roads that Germany had, so everything got bogged down. The tanks had to be used to pull the troop transports out of the mud. The transports had sunk up to their axles because that's how thick the rain and the mud was. And then in early October, everything starts freezing and the snow started falling. October, and we're talking like October 9th. So really, he only had effectively 3 months of warfare before everything started falling apart. The troops had no winter gear, so they were freezing to death. They didn't even have gear that would have been normal for a German winter. Certainly not anything that would survive the negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit that temperatures routinely fall to in Soviet Russia during the winters. So they had no winter wears, they're freezing to death, and Hitler basically just flipped his shit. He turned over his entire military command in the Soviet Union, firing general after general after general, and then just said, okay, fine, I'm going to take control. I will be the supreme guy. I will take charge myself. Y'all are fired. I'm doing this. But that defeat, and not even defeat in combat, defeat by weather, and from here, Germans knew they were no longer invincible. I mean, up to this point, they'd taken some losses, which they sort of expected. I mean, while Hitler may not think it's fair for people to fight back, soldiers know people are going to fight back. But at this point, this was their loss. They lost big, and they knew it. And that doubt starts to set in. And once you become of your own mortality, you're sort of loath to lose it. Now, in December 41, Hitler's ally in the Far East, which was Japan, so this is his first winter in Russia, Japan decides they're ready to start taking action and help out their Axis buddies west of them. And Hitler thinks that this means that they're going to come in and bomb Singapore and kind of start to pull British interest away from what they're doing in Poland, and then maybe come up from the east and attack Russia from behind, forcing Stalin to fight a two-front war. And it never seemed to occur to him that Japan might have their own agenda, which does not involve just doing what Hitler tells them to do. And so this becomes a problem. The main reason it's a problem is because Hitler routinely underestimated America's military strength. He was pretty sure America was run by, hang on a second, it was a Jewish cabal of Freemasons, which, okay then, maybe we are, I don't know. He certainly believed it, despite, I mean, basically people told him what he wanted to hear, and he wanted to hear that America was run by a Jewish cabal of Freemasons, and so this is what he believed. And so, because of course nothing good ever came out of the Jewish people, you know, that was all bad, and so he was going to roll over us after taking the eastern half of the world, or whatever. We're a globe, it's hard to say. December 7th, 1941, Japan bombs Pearl Harbor. And America, who had been sort of aiding the British, I mean, it wasn't a declared war, but they were certainly sending supplies and helping to keep their supply lines through Africa open. America joins the war. And America was more than capable of maintaining a two-front war. More than capable. So Hitler, he actually thought it was a great thing. I mean, it wasn't the target he had wanted, but he was at this point, he knew that America was definitely coming in at this point. He decided he's going to declare war first. So, okay, fine. He declares war. We're ready to rock and roll. We start sending people over to help with the bombings and start training our troops. Meanwhile, over on the Eurasian continent, the Russian winter proceeded to beat the ever-living snot out of the invading Germans. In 1942, Germany continues to try and take the Soviet Union, and nothing happens, nothing but failure and death. Hitler kind of decides that Stalingrad needs to be the city that falls. If they can take Stalingrad, they'll totally demoralize the Russians, because that's the city named after Stalin, because reasons. I mean, I don't know what he was thinking. He was freaking insane. I swear to God, I think he may have had some sort of a mental disease. Or maybe somewhere in the book I read that he had this thing about, wanting to maintain the sexual health, and so syphilis was a bad thing. I wonder if he had syphilis and it was eating his brain from the inside out. He was so fucking bonkers. Germany thought that they could take Stalingrad. The problem is, by this point, the people in Russia were very aware that the Germans were no better. I mean, the Soviets sucked. Okay, we saw that last month with the Gulag Archipelago. They were just as brutal, just as vile. If their people surrendered to Germans, then when they came back, they were again imprisoned in the gulags, because how dare you surrender to this enemy? You should fight to the death, not want to live. The problem with trying to replace one brutal dictatorial regime with another is that the people over whom you're fighting are probably going to decide it's better the devil you know than the devil you don't. So while Stalinist Russia sucked, once the people in the already conquered territories realized that things were going to be no better under Germany, and they were screwed anyways, they decided they'd better fight like mad to make sure the Soviets won, because that's the devil they know. They at least got a shot with the devil they know. With that thought in mind, Stalingrad turned to an absolute killing field. I feel like I read somewhere this was called the Sniper's War, and it was brutal. I've read books on that. I'm probably going to have to go back and reread them to refresh my memory to give a more accurate accounting. But the Germans at Stalingrad knew they were dying. They knew they could not win this battle, and they asked Hitler for permission to retreat and regroup, and were ordered to stand to the last man, which they did, until they were surrounded and taken to the gulags. Political prisoners. Again, we learned last month just how bad the political prisoners are treated in the gulags. There were like 258,000 Germans that were sent over with this particular unit. After Stalingrad, I think 91,000 went to the gulags. 5,000 returned. That's how bad that was. Now, the Germans did not treat their prisoners of war any better than the Russians did. The word slave has its root in Slav. All right, the northern tribes of Germania used to sell the Slavic people to the Romans because humanity has always been shitty. All right, we have always done this to each other. Well, Hitler decided he was going to renew the term, and he began using the Jews and the Slavs as slave labor in manufacturing war goods. Now, this is against Geneva Conventions, but I think it's pretty obvious Hitler did not give two shits about the Geneva Conventions. Anyone who had been captured by the German army was subject to this forced labor, and the need for labor actually slowed down the gas chambers a little bit, because the German upper echelon started complaining that there weren't enough slaves to do their bidding, and that maybe we should work them for a bit before just killing them all. That's twisted, but there was that. I think the general horrors of what went on in the camps is pretty well known. I mean, this is documented. Volumes have been written on individual camps and the monsters that ran them, the industrialization of murder which occurred under Nazi Germany. These are known quantities, and yes, they are addressed in the book. He addresses the gas chambers in Auschwitz and the mobile murder vans of the Einsatzgruppen, the medical experiments that led to the Nuremberg codes against forced medical experiments. All of this is addressed. He doesn't go into great detail. He does talk about certain individual experiments that were done with testing body temperatures, how long could somebody survive in freezing temperatures, what was needed to reheat them to a normal, healthy level. Other books have been written on it that cover it in more detail, which I think it's more important than going into what he said here, because the horrors shouldn't be forgotten. And he just doesn't address them in depth. He kind of glosses over that section. I'm not sure why. It may have been for length, maybe, but he just doesn't cover. He doesn't even mention Joseph Mengele, and we all know he was the monster, like the true monster of the camps. Doesn't mention Ilse Cook, although he does mention her penchants for liking to make lampshades out of tattooed skins. It's creepy, right? Totally creepy. I may read a book on her just for the creep factor. Maybe I'll do that next year. He has a chapter on the Allied invasion and the final assassination attempt against Hitler. And this was a frustrating chapter because he calls it the Allied invasion, and then he talks like 2 pages out of 70 on the Allied invasion at Normandy, and the rest of it is spent talking about Valkyrie, which is important. Don't get me wrong. I think it's very important to understand that no, not all of Germany backed him. Not all of Germany wanted this Nazi regime, and that there was a dedicated core that tried to kill him multiple times. I mean, they talked about it for pretty much the time he took over as chancellor, all the way up till they themselves were killed for their failed attempt. Valkyrie is so famous that this has been made into Hollywood movies. I mean, I think the last one was made with Tom Cruise as the lead role of Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg. Obviously, the attempt failed because Hitler lived to the very bitter end. But it was from lack of coordination, essentially. They just didn't have their ducks in a row, and they kept waddling off course, and everything turned to shit, and ultimately they were dead. Now, there was a lot of top brass that was involved in this. I mean, basically half of that forcibly retired field staff from the Soviet winter, Beck, Halder, Albrecht, von Tresckow, they were all part of this. Rommel was part of it. Rommel was his main general on the African front before he was chased out of Africa by the Allies responding. This truly was a global war here. I mean, we covered everything. He went ballistic when he found out the level of betrayal. Hitler did. He basically took it on their families. Beck, Halder, Albrecht, they were all killed. Their families were killed or shuffled into concentration camps. Rommel was one of the exceptions because he had been so touted as a hero of the Reich that when the SS came for him, he was advised that if he would honorably commit suicide, they would give him a state funeral and say that his death was not a suicide or a murder or part of the assassination plot, but that it was part of a head trauma sustained during an accident he'd had a few months before, and his family would be left alive. They would leave his family alive, but with full military honors. And Rommel, because he loved his family, agreed, and so he took the poison and was buried exactly as they said. But Rommel was part of this plot. I mean, by 1944, like July 1944, I think is when this happened, they all knew that the Reich was going down in flames and that Hitler was going to destroy the country with him. Almost from the first paratrooper landing in Normandy on June 6, 1944, the Germans retreated. They had to. From that point forward, the Allied advance was continuous and merciless on both fronts. At this point, Russia has joined the Allies. He's flipped sides because, hey, Hitler freaking attacked him, and they started driving together, pushing the Germans back into Germany. And with every forced retreat, Hitler became more and more enraged. He threatened the infantry with treason and death if they retreated or if they surrendered, just like with the Soviets on the Eastern Front, who did the same thing to their troops. Hitler himself retreated to his bunker in Berlin, determined not to flee the capital, but to kind of hold there until victory returned to Germany. The last chapter of the book basically describes the last month of the war and also the last month of Hitler's life. He became increasingly unhinged. He was prone to insane temper tantrums, and just kind of the rats started fleeing the sinking ship. Both Göring and Himmler tried to claim that they were taking over the party from various safety zones outside of the front. Hitler found out about it, denounced them both as traitors, removed them from the party, and ordered them shot on sight for their betrayal. Hitler's long-term mistress, Eva Braun, joined him in the bunker. They had never married throughout all of this because Hitler said that he had to be available to run the country. Didn't happen, or rather, he ran the country right into the ground, and Eva Braun joined him in the bunker. They got married 2 days before committing joint suicide. His absolute most loyal follower was his propaganda minister, Dr. Joseph Goebbels, and his wife Magda. They ensured that their 6 children were given lethal doses of poison and then ordered the bunker guards to shoot them in the back of the head and burn their bodies. This was done, but not well. After Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide, their bodies were put into a shelled-out hole, doused in like 200 gallons of gasoline and set on fire. So there was nothing left, and multiple witnesses report this and confirm this. So I know there's a lot of conspiracies that Hitler escaped to Brazil and lived till the ripe old age of 92. He did not. He put a bullet in his fucking head and then was burned to a crisp, so there was nothing left. Okay. The Goebbels were shot in the back of the head, a little bit of gas was dumped over them, they were lit on fire, and then they were just left to burn or smolder, and boom, everybody else beat feet. The Russians came in, immediately identified the Goebbels, and we only know what happened to Hitler because after the fact, some of those rats were caught and they talked. Again, multiple independent stories under separate interrogations confirmed Hitler's death. All right. The Reich survived approximately 7 days after Hitler's death. It couldn't survive without him. And so he committed suicide, and the Reich capitulated, and the war was over in Europe. Not in Japan, not in the West, not in the Pacific Front. The victory in Europe was declared in 45, like May something. Now, I'm going to start real quick with what I didn't like about this book so I can end with high notes. Now, the author tries to draw a parallel between old German history and use that, and I mean, like, I'm talking the Lutheran revolutions and how Luther was also anti-Semitic. Martin Luther, not King Jr., he was a good man. I'm talking Martin Luther, Protestant Reformationist of the 16th century? I think he was the 16th century. But Schreier is trying to draw a parallel and saying this is why Germans embraced Nazism. But at the same time, he's also saying that Hitler never had more than, 37% of the vote? And also explaining the multiple assassination attempts. Valkyrie was the most famous, but there were lots of Germans who wanted him dead. Remember, we had the German who turncoat in Berlin, who got information to the Americans about the Russian invasion. There were a lot of Germans who didn't agree with him. And so trying to say the entire country was primed and focused and ready for Nazism, it's a stretch to me. Now, I think that at the time this book was written, and a lot of his sources are primary sources, and these are pulled directly from the interrogations and trials at Nuremberg. So it's important history, but most credible historians in the interim have denounced that as a reason. They don't think that Germany was an inherently racist nation. I don't think anything is an inherently racist nation, but Germany was certainly not. By the time Hitler took power, he moved so fast at securing his power base that there was nothing they could do about it. Assassination was essentially their only option, and most people were so busy trying to just live their daily lives they couldn't get involved to that effect. And I understand that a lot of people think that makes them racist, but what do you think is happening in America right now? People are too busy trying to live to really effectively fight back against an overreaching government. Mostly we're engaging in passive civil disobedience, not active open engagements, which is fine, all right? This is America. We are a better armed nation than anybody else on the country. We don't want this to ever go to a hot disobedience. Civil disobedience is exactly what we're here for. That's what the Constitution protects us for, is that civil disobedience, right? Our first line of defense is the ballot box, guys. We just don't use it effectively. So, new information from the time this book was written in the late 50s, early 60s, has essentially rejected that. It's kind of why I chose to review Ordinary Men about the Police Battalion 101 and not the other book that was written about that same police battalion. And I don't remember that book's name, and I'm probably never going to read it because that other author also buys into the entire country is racist. Christopher Browning, who wrote Ordinary Men, rejects the sins of the father school of thought, and he kind of dug a little deeper into it. I think the studies he refers to in that book probably occurred after The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich was written, so again, new information changes the picture. Now, what I did like, I do think this book is important historically. It's a slog. It's not easy reading, especially 50 years after it was written when everybody's attention spans have gotten considerably shorter. I mean, 90 seconds, 2 minutes, we have short attention spans these days. But I think Shire did an amazing job combing through that first source documentation. When the Allied forces rolled over Germany, they captured huge archives of Nazi documentation, and these first-person accounts are instrumental in understanding what happened. And this failure to teach what has happened is kind of leading to the rise of Antifa and all of their ignorant hypocrisy and all of its horrifying glory. It's contributing to this huge division in America today, this othering, this dehumanizing of people who disagree with us. That is exactly what the Nazis did. So yes, if you have ever called somebody deplorable, Trump-tard, snowflake, libtard, you are guilty of this. Stop it. Stop letting those who work for us divide us like this. This book tries to be an everything about Nazi Germany book, and I think it's a good jumping off point. The challenge is that there are so many moving parts over this period of history. I mean, it's the 12 years of the actual Nazi party being in power, and the decade before that when Hitler was first getting his feet into politics, that I don't think one book can effectively encompass it. There are entire books dedicated just to the last month of Hitler's life. And we're talking like 300-400 page books just for that 1 month. He dedicated 85 pages to it. I mean, that's how detailed this is. Most World War II books cover a single incident, a single battle like Dunkirk or Stalingrad, a single general like Rommel or Patton, or even a single military unit like Band of Brothers and the 101st Airborne. This book only covered Nazi Germany and the European theater and only peripherally touched on the Pacific theater, and then only because that is what got America involved. It barely scratches Africa and Rommel's advances there and Eisenhower sweeping in. So, I mean, even though I just read 1,145 pages on this topic, I feel like I've barely scratched the surface of World War II. And that's it for this week. It's a long video, guys, but it was a lot to cover. If I had known it was going to be this mentally taxing, I probably would have flipped my August and September reading lists and done this one in August when I had 4 weeks to stretch it out, and done Gulag Archipelago this month, leaving out Ivan Denisovich. But it is what it is. This is where we're at. It is what it is, and I am now more educated on the shitty things that people do to each other. We do a lot of shitty things to each other. Humanity is just shitty. People are just shitty. If you've watched along, thank you so much. You are also a little more educated too. I will see you next week. Next week we move on to happier topics. We're going to return to presidents, and it'll be John Quincy Adams. So I will see you next week. Bye.